And so, with the coming of the railroads, you had both opportunities and opportunists. Now, opportunities, those are pretty clear cut. You see the chance to actually make some money, you put forth the effort and whatnot, and there you go. Opportunists are usually scammers. They're usually people who are trying to take advantage of people. So, you're going to see a little bit of both in these situations, okay? Now, I'm going to start off talking about new towns and new markets, basically. You've got to understand, with the railroad came commerce, and that commerce meant that more and more people would be able to trade more and more freely. And the more trade there was, the more towns would grow because you could get more things into your particular town. This trade encouraged the growth of towns. The towns that were coming up at this time generally started off as areas where maybe the railroads had to stop to get water or something like that for the steam engines, or it was a spot where they would bring in all the crops, load onto a train or something like that. But there was this encouragement for the growth of towns just because of the fact the railroad was there. These towns grew along the rail lines because that's where all the commerce was happening. Now, you think today we have a great deal of things like, say, Amazon and stuff like that. You can pretty much do commerce anywhere. This point in time, you really needed to be closer to the railroad tracks. And you'll see that in old towns and whatnot, they actually grew up closer to the railroad tracks. The oldest part of most towns are right along the railroad tracks. So you're seeing the growth of trade, and with that trade, you're seeing the growth of towns. And all of this is tied back to the railroads. Now, let's talk about a guy by the name of Pullman. Okay, now here he is. Okay, this is George Pullman. Now, George Pullman built a factory that made sleepers and other railroad cars. Now, we mentioned previously that you could go through, you could get coast to coast in a week or so, but you got a couple of choices. One, are you just going to buy a seat and you're going to sit there for 6 or 7 days, and that's where you're going to sleep, eat, spend the time, everything like that? Or are you going to spend a little extra money and get a spot where you could actually lay down and sleep at night? Well, Pullman made both kinds of cars. He made cars for the railroads, for just people sitting in regularly, but he also made these sleeper cars that people would pay an extra, ever how much, and because of that, they didn't have to sleep in their seats. They could actually lay down at night, that kind of thing. But Pullman didn't just build a factory where he was going to make these various railroad cars. He actually, for his employees, built a nearby town. He built an entire town just to house his employees. Now, you think about it. One of the things that people are concerned with a job is, where are they going to live while they're working there? Are they going to be able to commute today? Now, back then, commuting was not really a thing, but, it would be a consideration. So, his new town offered things like housing. Now, it wasn't free. You did have to pay rent, of course, but it was close to work and it had a lot of fringe benefits. There were things like doctor's offices there. There were shops, theaters, you name it. It had a lot of modern conveniences. It had the things that people wanted. And George Pullman went through and he created all of this to sort of make a wonderful little town for the people who were working for him. However, it is important to take note that while there was this town, and you did have the shops and the doctor's offices and your own place to live and all that fun stuff, the town was under company control. The Pullman Company, and George Pullman in particular, ran the town. They made the rules for how you're going to live there. It wasn't exactly like it was your home, you had bought it, you had paid for it, and therefore you could do whatever you want. Yes, you were paying rent, but it was George Pullman who actually put forth the rules for living there. For example, residents were not allowed to loiter on their front steps. So, this was a point in time where you had, generally speaking, porches and things like that. And people had a tendency, especially in the evenings, to go out on their front steps or on their porches and sit and visit with whomever happened to be walking by. Well, George Pullman's theory was that that led to shiftlessness and laziness and things like that. And so, therefore, you couldn't do that. You could actually get in trouble for just sort of hanging out at the front of your own home. Plus, he also forbade the use of any alcohol. He was one who believed that the town should be dry. And so there were a lot of rules like this. Now, Pullman was going through and he was doing all this with the best of intentions. He was legitimately trying to make the best town possible for his employees. It's just he thought that his way was the only way, and as such, they had to follow the rules. Now, for the most part, people were okay with this. They were willing to accept what was going on and all that. But eventually, you're going to see later on, there came to be some economic difficulties, and things went downhill. 1894, Pullman cut wages, but not the rents. So you are now making less money, but your expenses were still the same. And this in turn led to a strike. His employees would go through and they went on strike, would not go back to work. It got so bad that eventually the National Guard literally had to be called in. The military had to come in and restore order because of what all was going on. Pullman's town, this never really recovered. And as a result, his own, we'll say short-sightedness in cutting the wages but not rent, this led to essentially his own undoing. But again, Pullman was doing this literally out of the best of intentions. He was going through doing this because he thought that this is what was going to help his workers the most. He was doing everything out of, a good heart, shall we say. Unfortunately, not everyone around this time was working out of the goodness of their own hearts. Some of the people, now we're getting to that opportunists thing, they were working trying to line their own pockets. To a scandal known as Crédit Mobilier. Okay, I'm not sure if it's pronounced right. You probably are looking at that and think Crédit Mobilier. If that's the way you think of it when you see it, by all means, feel free. Now, Crédit Mobilier was a construction company that was formed by the stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad. See, the government did not have enough money to pay for all of the railroad. So what they did in turn, they were giving away land to the railroad companies. But the problem was the more track that was laid, the more land they were given. So they made sure to, put as many curves in as possible. Basically, they were trying to get as much land out of the government as possible. Now, they also wanted to get as much cash as they could. And so you think about it. You go through, you plan out a railroad, you get all the track figured out where you're going to lay everything down, but then you have to actually physically hire people to do the actual work. So the stockholders at Union Pacific, they basically created a company called Crédit Mobilier, and then they hired their company to lay track. Generally speaking, they were going to charge 2 to 3 times what the actual cost was. Let's say it was actually going to cost them, $1,000 a mile. I don't know. I'm totally making up these numbers. If they said it was going to, if it was really going to cost $1,000, they would charge $2,000 to $3,000 per mile. They would bill the government, and then they would get money out of it that way. So they were basically hiring themselves to go through and get as much cash as they could out of Congress. Now, in order to keep everybody happy with this, they donated shares of stock to the members of Congress. So they're donating stock to the Congress, which is paying the bills that they're handing to them for the railroad track that Congress has asked them to lay. If that seems convoluted, it is. And what's more, it worked. It was one of those scams that seemed to be working. Nobody was really paying that much attention to it, until a story broke in a newspaper called the New York Sun. Now, the New York Sun went through and they broke the story. And this meant that Congress had to investigate what was happening. So Congress was now investigating what was going on with a company that many of the congressmen actually owned stock in. So basically, Congress is being told to investigate Congress. Now, while that may sound goofy, it's no worse than saying, let's say you've been accused of a crime, and it is now your responsibility to do the research to find out whether or not you committed the crime you were accused of. Now, there are those who would be brutally honest, and in such a situation, if they really did it, they would say, yes, I did. But most of human nature is going to be, no, I didn't do that. Well, lo and behold, Congress discovered that, well, there may have been some irregularities, but nobody got in trouble for it. The public figures, the people in Congress and whatnot, the stockholders, everybody, they got to keep their money. They did get a slap on the wrist, though. This was essentially Congress looked at themselves and went, hey, and that was about it. So there wasn't going to be another scandal like this. This kind of was going to break the chances of this ever really happening again, because now you had the newspapers were keeping a much more careful eye on stuff. But for a while, this was the scandal. It reached as far as members of the White House. Basically, they were able to get away with it. It was one of those scandals that has gone down in history.